The police captain's hand hit the wall 6 inches from Emily Carter's face. His spit landed on her scrubs. Around them, the trauma bay of Pinecrest Regional Hospital had gone dead silent. Doctors frozen, nurses pressed against counters, a man bleeding through his bandages on the gurney behind them all. "You're finished," Captain Rourke snarled. "Get out of my hospital before I put you in cuffs." Emily didn't move, didn't blink. She looked at him the way a person looks at weather, something loud and temporary. "Lower your voice," she said quietly. "Before the military gets here." Rourke laughed. The other officers laughed. Then the windows shook. The rhythmic thunder of rotors filled the sky above Brookhaven. 3 helicopters, military markings, dropping fast toward the roof. Nobody in that room knew what Emily Carter had done before she became a nurse. But they were about to find out. If this story stops you cold, follow along to the end. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift started at 6 in the morning, the way most of Emily Carter's shifts started, with someone else's emergency and not enough time. She clocked in at 5:52, changed in the locker room without talking to anyone, and walked onto the floor of Pinecrest Regional Hospital's trauma unit, carrying a thermos of coffee she'd already half finished in the parking lot. The fluorescent lights above the nurses' station were doing that thing again. The subtle flicker in the third panel from the left that maintenance had been promising to fix for 11 weeks. Emily had stopped reporting it. She just knew which parts of the hallway to avoid when she had a migraine. Brookhaven was the kind of mid-sized city that appeared on no one's top 10 list. It sat in the crease between 2 interstate systems, humid in summer, gray in winter, and perpetually 3 years behind whatever trend had already left the larger metros. Pinecrest Regional was its biggest hospital, a Level 2 trauma center that handled everything from farm equipment accidents to the occasional gunshot wound that came in from the eastern side of town, where the money ran out and the options ran thin. Emily had been working there for 7 months, long enough to know which attending physicians were worth trusting and which ones spent more time managing liability than managing patients. Long enough to know that the break room coffee maker had been broken since October, and no one with actual authority cared. Long enough to have become invisible in exactly the way she preferred. She was 29 years old. She looked younger to people who didn't look carefully. She was 5'6", lean in the way that came from a body that had been pushed past comfortable limits and adapted rather than quit. She wore her dark hair back in a practical knot and had a small scar along her left jawline that she'd stopped thinking about years ago. Her hands were steady, her voice was level. She didn't take up space unnecessarily. The day nurse she was relieving, a heavy-set man named Dale, who always looked mildly exhausted, handed over the status board with a shrug. Bed 3's a chest compression case from overnight, stable but watching. Bed 7's a sepsis workup, culture results pending. Bed 12? He paused, lowered his voice slightly. That one's complicated. Emily looked at the board. Bed 12 had a notation she didn't usually see on trauma floor charts. The initials MIL next to the admission code. Military, federal hold. Who is he? They're not saying. The attending got pulled aside by some suit this morning around 4 a.m. Whatever they told him, he hasn't smiled since. Dale pocketed his pen. Captain Rourke's been in and out since 5. He's got 2 uniforms posted outside bed 12. Emily didn't react visibly. She just looked at the board another second, then nodded. I'll start with chest compression and work east. Dale was already pulling on his jacket. Good luck, he said, in the tone that meant he genuinely meant it, but was glad it was her problem now. Captain Rourke found her 40 minutes into her shift. She was at the medication cart, pulling the morning run for the sepsis patient in bed 7, when she heard the footsteps, heavier than a nurse's, more deliberate than a doctor's, the particular rhythm of someone who considered his presence a statement. She didn't look up. Nurse Carter. She looked up. Rourke was in his 50s, built like a man who had been athletic once and was coasting on the residual infrastructure. He had the kind of face that probably photographed well at city council events. Square jaw, decent posture, the practiced authority of someone who had never in his career been seriously questioned by anyone he couldn't dismiss. He wore his captain's uniform like armor. He had two junior officers behind him who were doing their best to look important by standing close to him. "Captain?" She held his gaze. Not challenging, just present. "I need to know what you've been told about the patient in bed 12. I've been told to monitor vitals and flag any changes to the attending." "That's all?" "That's all." Rourke studied her for a moment with the expression of a man who is used to reading people and confident in his readings. "Good. Keep it that way. You don't ask questions about that room. You don't discuss that patient with anyone on this floor. You don't go in unless you're specifically authorized. Are we clear?" Emily held his gaze a beat longer than was comfortable. "I'm authorized to provide medical care. That's my job." "Your job today," Rourke said, and his voice shifted into the register people use when they want you to feel small, "is to do exactly what you're told and stay out of matters you don't understand." He walked away. The two junior officers followed. Emily went back to the medication cart. The sepsis patient in bed 7 was a 61-year-old woman named Mrs. Nora Featherly, who had been brought in 2 nights ago with what her family had initially assumed was a bad flu. She was mostly awake now, uncomfortable and anxious, and she grabbed Emily's wrist when Emily came in to check her line. "Is my daughter here yet?" "She called the desk about an hour ago. She's driving from Siler City. Should be here before noon. The doctor told me I might have to stay another 3 days. Mrs. Featherly's grip tightened slightly. "I can't be here 3 days. I have my dog." "What's the dog's name?" A pause. "Rutherford. Is he the kind of dog who can stay with a neighbor? Or is he the kind of dog who needs to be walked at exactly the same time every morning or the whole day, falls apart?" The woman almost smiled. "The second kind." "Okay, when your daughter gets here, let's make sure she gets Rutherford sorted out. Then you can focus on getting better without worrying about him." Emily adjusted the drip, checked the site, made a note. "Culture results should be back by 10. Then we'll know more." She left Mrs. Featherly calmer than she'd found her, which was a small thing, the kind of small thing that nobody except the patient ever remembered, but that Emily had learned a long time ago was the actual substance of the job. At 8:20 a.m., the patient in bed 12 crashed. Emily was at the nurse's station when the monitor alert came through. She was already moving before the sound fully registered. That was training, the kind that happened below conscious thought, a body that had been conditioned over years to move first and assess while moving. She hit the doorway of bed 12 at the same moment as Dr. Thad Okonkwo, the attending who had been managing the room since the federal notification. There were 2 uniformed officers inside the room who had absolutely no idea what to do. The man in the bed was maybe 45, gray at the temples, with the lean and particular build of someone who spent serious time in the field. He was listed on the chart under an admission alias. The name had too many consonants, the way fake names often did when someone put one together in a hurry. He was in full cardiac distress, heart rate spiking erratically, blood pressure tanking. Emily stepped to the bed. The monitors were screaming. "BP's at 80/50 and dropping," she said, not to anyone in particular, just organizing information aloud. "Heart rate's irregular. This isn't a standard cardiac event." Okonkwo was already pulling the crash cart. "I see it. His last vitals were checked 40 minutes ago. This escalation is too fast for a natural progression." She pulled back the man's gown at the chest and saw something, a slight discoloration at the IV insertion site. She leaned in. "Dr. Okonkwo, I'm here?" "Look at this site." Okonkwo looked. His expression changed. The discoloration was subtle. Most people would have written it off as bruising from the insertion or skin sensitivity. But Emily had seen it before, in a different context, in a different country, in a medical environment where someone had tried something similar and almost gotten away with it. "That's not a standard reaction," she said. "Something's wrong with what's in his line." She reached for the IV connection. One of the officers stepped forward. "Don't touch that." "Excuse me?" "Captain Rourke's orders. Nobody touches anything in this room without authorization." Emily looked at the man in the bed. His lips were faintly blue. His fingers were pale. The monitor shrieked another alarm. "This man is going to die in approximately 4 minutes," Emily said. Her voice was completely flat. "If you want to explain to Captain Rourke why that happened, Step aside and let me help him. Or keep blocking me and start preparing what you're going to say." The officer hesitated. That was enough. Emily disconnected the IV. Rourke arrived 6 minutes later, by which time Emily and Okonkwo had stabilized the patient enough that the immediate crisis had passed. The man was still critical. He needed a level of care that Pinecrest's general floor couldn't provide. But he was breathing. His pressure was climbing back. Rourke took one look at the scene. The disconnected IV, Emily at the bedside, the nurses and officers crowded in the room, and his face went to a color that wasn't quite red and wasn't quite purple. "What the hell happened in here?" Okonkwo started to explain. Rourke cut him off. "I'm not asking you." He pointed at Emily. "You. What did you do?" "I disconnected a compromised IV line and provided emergency intervention on a patient who was coding." "You were told not to touch anything in this room." "I was told not to discuss the patient. I was never told to let him die." Rourke moved into the room. He was close enough now that Emily could see the individual lines in his face, the way his jaw set when he was trying to construct authority out of anger. "You violated a direct order from a law enforcement officer at a federally secured scene. I performed my job. That is not your call to make." "Actually," Emily said quietly, "in a medical emergency, it is." For a moment, nobody in the room breathed. Rourke turned to the officers. "Get her out of here, now." They walked her out to the hallway, not cuffed, but close. One officer on each side, Rourke following, and the entire trauma floor staff watching from stations and doorways. It was the specific variety of humiliation designed to communicate that whatever you believed you were wrong, that you were manageable, that the person doing this to you held a power you couldn't argue with. Emily walked without resistance. She looked straight ahead. Rourke stopped her in the main corridor between the trauma unit and the elevator bank, where the most people could see. He planted himself in front of her. "You want to know what happens to nurses who interfere with police operations?" His voice was loud. He wasn't trying to hide this conversation. "They lose their licenses. They face obstruction charges. They don't work in this city again." He leaned in slightly. "Are you understanding me? You're finished here." Emily looked at him. She said nothing for 3 full seconds. "You may want to lower your voice," she said, "before the military gets here." Rourke's expression shifted. He almost laughed, and then thought better of it. "The military." He looked at his officers with the expression of someone who wanted witnesses to the absurdity. "The military." "Yes." "And why would the military be coming here, Nurse Carter?" "Because that man in bed 12 is a senior intelligence officer with a special operations command attached to his clearance. And when his vitals dropped, the alert went to people who actually know who he is." She held Rourke's gaze. "You might want to make some decisions about how you want to be standing when they walk through that door." The words landed. Rourke processed them. He decided she was bluffing. He was in the middle of deciding that when the windows shook. The sound came before the sight. Deep, rhythmic, mechanical. The sound of rotors at low altitude. The particular timbre of military aircraft that Emily recognized from years of hearing it in places where it meant something immediate was about to happen. The windows on the east side of the corridor vibrated in their frames. The overhead lights flickered. Someone at the nurses' station went to the window. "There are helicopters on the roof." Rourke turned slowly. He looked at Emily. She looked back at him. Her expression hadn't changed. The elevator dinged. They came through the doors in tactical formation. Not combat, but purposeful. The movement of people who had trained to enter complicated spaces with efficiency and zero wasted motion. 4 of them in the initial group, in military utility uniforms, with the kind of bearing that announces itself without volume. Behind them, a man in his 40s with a silver oak leaf on his collar and a posture that had probably been corrected so many times it was now simply structural. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus DeVoe scanned the corridor. His eyes moved past Rourke, past the officers, past the nurses, and found Emily Carter at the center of the hallway, standing between 2 uniformed police officers who suddenly looked significantly less certain of themselves. DeVoe walked to her, not toward the nursing station, not toward Rourke, directly to Emily. He stopped. He stood at a precise distance, and then, in front of everyone present on that floor, he brought his right hand up in a sharp, clean salute. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, "we came as fast as we could. Are you injured?" The trauma corridor of Pinecrest Regional Hospital went completely silent. Emily returned the salute with the muscle memory of someone who had done it thousands of times. "I'm fine, sir. The patient is stabilized but critical. I need to brief you on what I found in the IV line." "We'll get to that in 30 seconds. DeVoe lowered his hand. He looked at her for a moment with an expression Emily couldn't quite categorize. Not pride exactly, something older and more complicated. "Good call disconnecting that line. It was the only call." "I know." He turned and, for the first time, seemed to notice Rourke. He looked at the captain the way senior military officers look at obstacles, registering, categorizing, and moving on. "Who's the law enforcement lead?" Rourke recovered enough to step forward. "I'm Captain Rourke, Brookhaven PD. This is a federally coordinated—" "I'm aware of what this is. I'm the one who coordinated it." DeVoe handed him nothing. Not warmth, not deference, not the institutional acknowledgement that Rourke was used to receiving. "Nurse Carter is under my command and is essential to this patient's care. Any action taken against her in the last hour is being reviewed as of this moment. If you've issued any orders that affect her position here, I'd recommend you prepare a written account of your reasoning." He paused. "Is there anything you'd like to clarify before we continue?" Rourke looked at Emily. Emily was already turning toward the patient's room, briefing DeVoe as they walked. Captain Rourke stood in the corridor, flanked by his own officers, in a hospital he had controlled 40 minutes ago, and tried to remember the last time a room had shifted beneath him that completely. Inside bed 12, DeVoe's team swept the space with the speed of people who had done this in worse conditions. A medical officer attached to the unit, a compact woman named Captain Reyes, who moved with the efficiency of someone who had treated patients in the backs of vehicles, while those vehicles were still moving, took over the physical assessment while Emily walked her through the IV situation. "I didn't pull a sample before I disconnected," Emily said. "I was managing time, not evidence." "You kept him alive," Reyes said. "That's the sample that matters. Someone tampered with that line in the last hour. I know." Reyes didn't look up from the patient's arm. "We've been watching the security feed since the alert. There's a gap. 11 minutes between the last confirmed visual on this room and the time you walked in. 11 minutes is enough." "More than enough." Reyes stood. "He's stable enough to transport. We're moving him to the secure unit at Harwick Air Force Base. He'll be out of here within 20 minutes. Emily nodded. She looked at the man in the bed, this stranger whose name she still didn't know, whose face she might not recognize on the street. He was breathing evenly now. His color was coming back. She hadn't saved his life because she knew who he was. She'd done it because he was a person in front of her, and the numbers on his monitor were going the wrong direction. That was the full extent of the calculation. It was always the full extent. DeVoe found her at the nurse's station 15 minutes later, writing her incident report in the precise, unembellished language she'd learned years ago. The kind of documentation that held up, that left no space for interpretation, that made clear what had happened and in what sequence. He waited. She finished the section she was writing before she looked up. "You could have told them," he said. "Told them what?" "Who you were. What you did. It might have avoided the morning." Emily considered that. "They wouldn't have believed me. They would have had to. People believe rank when they want to. They believe it less when it disrupts something they've already decided." She set down her pen. "And telling them wouldn't have helped the patient. It just would have redirected the argument." DeVoe was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man revising something he'd already concluded. "Your file says you put in separation papers 18 months ago." "That's correct." "Nobody tried to stop you." "A few people tried." She picked up her pen again. "I was better at the argument than they were. And now you're here. And now I'm here." There was something DeVoe was working up to. Emily could read the shape of it the way she read the shape of everything, by paying attention to what was adjacent to the words instead of just the words themselves. She waited. "We're going to need a statement about what you found in that room," he said finally. "Full account, chain of observation, what you saw at the site, why you made the call you made." "Already writing it." "Emily." He rarely used her first name. She registered it. "What you saw in that IV line, the discoloration, the pattern of it, that's a specific signature. You recognized it." She looked at him for a moment. "Halobane compound," she said, "or something close enough to it. I saw it used twice overseas. Both times it was missed on initial assessment. One of those patients didn't make it to the second assessment." The name landed in the space between them with the weight of a specific and terrible memory. "We suspected something in the cardiotoxin category," DeVoe said. "You should run it against the modified variants. Whoever did this knows what they're doing. They're not using something off the shelf." "That narrows our list." "Significantly." DeVoe nodded. He straightened, the small physical gesture that meant a conversation was shifting from personal to operational. "The federal team will be here within the hour. We're treating this as an assassination attempt on an active duty intelligence officer. This entire building is a crime scene until we can rule out additional threat vectors." Emily processed that. "You think there's someone else inside the hospital?" "We think it's possible." She looked at the board behind the nurses' station. 31 patients currently admitted, 11 staff on the floor, visitors coming and going, a building with 4 public entrances, 2 service access points, and an elevator bank that connected to the parking structure. "Then you need to start pulling the access logs from the last 18 hours, she said. "And you need to check the pharmacy dispensation records. If someone introduced a cardiotoxin compound through the IV line, they needed access to something to carry it. It didn't come in through the front door." DeVoe looked at her. "Are you offering to help with the investigation?" "I'm a nurse in this hospital," Emily said. "I know this floor. I know the routines, the gaps, the places people cut corners on documentation." She picked up the incident report and handed it to him. "I'm offering to be useful. What you do with that is your decision." He took the report without hesitation. "Then let's get started." The federal investigators arrived at 10:14 a.m. in 3 vehicles, unmarked, but nobody mistook them for anything else. They moved through the main entrance with IDs already out, asked no unnecessary questions, and immediately requested the hospital's security office. Rourke was still in the building. He'd retreated to the administrative wing, where Emily had been told by one of the charge nurses that he was on the phone with someone. She didn't know who. She didn't particularly care. She had 29 other patients, 3 of whom needed attention that had nothing to do with the situation developing around them. Mrs. Featherly's daughter had arrived at 9:45, a tall woman in her 30s who had driven 3 hours and walked in with the specific energy of someone who had been terrified in a car alone for too long and was only now beginning to let themselves stop moving. Emily had taken 5 minutes to pull her aside, explain what the culture results had come back showing, walk her through the treatment plan, and give her the name of the neighbor she'd found on the floor directory who might be able to check on Rutherford. The daughter had looked at her like she'd handed her something. Emily didn't say anything more. She moved to the next patient. The chest compression case in bed 3 had stabilized further and was talking about being moved to a step-down unit. Emily agreed with the attending's assessment, but flagged one reading in his last oxygen panel that she thought warranted watching for another 4 hours before they made the move. The attending, a young physician named Dr. Quinto, who still listened more than he talked, looked at the panel, looked at Emily, and said, "You're right. Let's hold until this afternoon." That was the job. The actual job. The rest of it, the helicopters, the federal presence, the captain who'd put his hand near her face this morning, was noise around the edges of something that mattered. But the noise was getting louder. At 11:30, one of DeVoe's people found her in the corridor and told her they needed her back in bed 12. Not the room. The patient was already being transferred, but the space itself, which was now being documented as a primary crime scene. "What did they find?" Emily asked. The soldier hesitated. "I'm cleared," she said. Not aggressively, just as fact. "They found a second access point," he said, "in the ventilation panel above the bed. Someone modified it recently. The screws on the cover plate are new, different metal than the original hardware." Emily looked at the ceiling of the corridor, at the ventilation panels running the length of the hallway, at all the ordinary institutional infrastructure of a building that hundreds of people move through every day without ever looking at it carefully. They were already inside the building before the patient was admitted, she said. That's what the investigators think. She was quiet for a moment. The shape of something was forming in the back of her mind, not certain yet, not ready to be named, but present. The specific pattern of a plan that had taken time, that had required access not just to this room, but to the systems that controlled who moved through it. Pull the maintenance request, she said, specifically HVAC, for this wing, going back 60 days. The soldier looked at her. That ventilation panel didn't modify itself, Emily said. Someone submitted a work order to have access, or they piggybacked on a work order that already existed. She paused. Either way, there's a paper trail. There's always a paper trail. She was already walking back toward the nurse's station, her mind running 2 tracks simultaneously. The patients who needed her and the shape of something that wasn't done yet. Something that had left a person coded in a bed this morning and been interrupted by 7 minutes of her shift. Something that, she was increasingly certain, had not finished what it had started. The federal agents in the security office were going to find it, or they weren't. That wasn't her call. Her call was the 31 people in the beds around her, and the floor that was her responsibility, and the IV lines and vitals and medication schedules that formed the specific and unglamorous infrastructure of keeping human beings alive. She sat down at the nurse's station. She pulled up the next chart. She started reading. At 11:47 a.m., 2 floors above her, a hospital employee whose ID badge read, "Maintenance slipped into a stairwell with a bag he hadn't arrived with and a timeline that was now almost certainly compromised." He didn't know that yet. Emily didn't know he existed yet. But in approximately 4 hours, both of those things were going to change. 4 hours was an optimistic estimate. It took 2. The call came from one of DeVoe's people, a young specialist named Hobart who had the particular energy of someone who had not slept and was running entirely on mission focus and bad vending machine coffee. He found Emily at the medication cart at 1:52 p.m. and said, in a voice low enough that the charge nurse 3 feet away couldn't catch it, "We need you in the basement." Emily looked at him. "I have a patient in 40 minutes who needs a dressing change." "I know, we'll get someone to cover. Lieutenant Colonel DeVoe says it's urgent." She handed the medication cart key to the nurse beside her, said, "Bed 7 at 2:30, dressing change Mrs. Featherly. Don't let them rush it," and followed Hobart to the service elevator. The basement of Pinecrest Regional was not the kind of place patients ever saw. It was the infrastructure layer, HVAC systems, electrical panels, medical supply storage, the long corridor that connected the main building to the older East Wing that had been built in 1987 and never properly integrated. The lighting down there was industrial, the floor was bare concrete, and it smelled like recycled air and old pipe insulation. DeVoe was standing in front of a section of wall that Emily had never paid attention to because there was nothing about it that invited attention. It was a utility corridor, wide enough for a supply cart, with ventilation ducting running along the ceiling and a row of access panels on the left side. 3 federal investigators were photographing and documenting in the careful, methodical way of people building a case rather than just gathering information. "Tell me what you see," DeVoe said when Emily stopped beside him. She looked. She didn't answer immediately because looking at something and seeing it were different actions, and she'd learned that the hard way. The access panel directly in front of them was, at first glance, identical to the others in the corridor. Same gray metal cover, same industrial latches, same general dimensions. But the pane around the upper right latch was cracked in a way the others weren't. The floor beneath it had a slight smear, too faint to be obvious but present, the kind of thing a shoe left when someone pivoted in a hurry. And the panel itself sat 2 millimeters off center from its frame, not enough to notice if you were walking past, enough to notice if you were looking. "Someone used this recently," she said. "More than once. The latchware is on the outside, not just the inside, which means they were opening it from this side, not from within the duct." "Correct." "The duct runs to the 4th floor?" "3rd and 4th, yes. It branches at the junction near the east stairwell." DeVoe pointed up at the routing along the ceiling. Someone who knew this layout could move between this basement access and the ventilation panel above bed 12 without passing through any staffed corridor. Emily processed that. Which means they knew the building. Intimately. Not a contractor who came in once. Someone who spent time learning this. That's our read. She looked at the smear on the floor again. You said maintenance requests. Did you find anything? One of the federal investigators, a woman in her 40s named Agent Solis, who had introduced herself with a handshake that suggested she didn't waste energy on social performance, looked up from her documentation. We found 3 HVAC work orders for this wing in the last 60 days. 2 were logged by a regular maintenance contractor whose schedule and access checks out. The 3rd was logged 6 weeks ago under a subcontractor ID that the hospital's facilities manager says he doesn't recognize. He doesn't recognize it? He says it was marked as a pressure inspection from the county. He says those come through automatically. He doesn't always cross-reference the IDs. So someone submitted a fake inspection order. Someone submitted a very good fake inspection order, Solis said, without any particular inflection. The paperwork would have passed a casual review. It was only when we started looking for it specifically that the discrepancy showed up. Emily turned back to DeVoe. 6 weeks. This wasn't improvised. No, this was built. Someone knew this patient was coming to this hospital before the patient knew he was coming to this hospital. The weight of that sentence settled in the corridor. Emily let it. The leaks in the planning chain, she said. That's our current primary theory. We have people working on that end. What we need here is to understand the access. Who in this building, staff, contractor, vendor, anyone, had the kind of time and knowledge to map this system without triggering suspicion? Emily thought about the rhythm of a hospital building, the way the days ran, the maintenance windows, the shift changes that created natural gaps in oversight. A person who understood that rhythm could move through a building like this more or less invisibly if they chose their times carefully. Shift change is your window, she said. 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. 20 minutes where the outgoing and incoming staff are both occupied with handover. Nobody's looking at who's moving through the service corridors. If someone spent a few weeks learning that window, they could be in and out of this basement in under 10 minutes without anyone noticing. Solis was writing. DeVoe nodded slowly. I need the access card logs for the service entrance, Emily continued, not the main staff entrance, the one on the south side by the loading dock. That's the one that gets the least camera coverage and the most casual use. Deliveries, contractors, people who've been here long enough that the security guard just waves them through. DeVoe looked at Solis. We have it, Solis said. We're cross-referencing now. Then you'll find something, Emily said. Not a prediction. A statement, the way a person states the temperature. DeVoe studied her for a moment. How do you know this building that well? You've been here 7 months. Emily picked a piece of lint off her scrubs. I walk the building every shift, full circuit before I start the patient floor. Every exit, every service access, every camera blind spot. She looked at him evenly. Old habit. He didn't ask where the habit came from. He already knew. They let her go back to her floor at 2:20, 10 minutes late for Mrs. Featherly's dressing change. The dressing had already been started by a younger nurse named Petra, who was competent but slightly too fast, the way new nurses sometimes were, technically correct but not quite reading the patient's discomfort accurately. Emily took over without making Petra feel dismissed, just adjusted the pace and talked to Mrs. Featherly while she worked. Your daughter's still here, Emily said. She's in the waiting room arguing with someone on her phone about her dog. Mrs. Featherly winced slightly as the old dressing came free. She drove 3 hours to worry about me from a different room. That's what daughters do. Did your mother do that? Emily considered the question. My mother is extremely practical. When I was hospitalized once, she sent me a very detailed email about what questions to ask the doctors and a list of recommended reading. Mrs. Featherly laughed, which made her wince again, which made her laugh harder. That's either terrible or wonderful. Mostly wonderful, Emily said. She came eventually, just needed to feel useful first. It was the kind of exchange that happened constantly in hospitals. The small human moments wedged between the clinical ones, and Emily had learned that they mattered as much as anything else. Not because they healed people, like they didn't, not directly, but because being seen as a person rather than a case was something that patients needed and that the system was structurally indifferent to. If she could give someone that in the middle of everything else, she did. She finished the dressing, made her notes, told Mrs. Featherly that the afternoon attending would stop by at 4 and was back in the corridor by 2:47. Rourke was waiting. He was standing near the nurse's station with a different energy than he'd had this morning. Not aggressive now, but recalculated. The way a person stands when they're trying to look like the situation is still manageable, and they know it isn't. He had his hat in his hands, which she hadn't seen before. People only held their hats when they were buying time. Nurse Carter. She walked to the station and pulled up the next chart. Captain, I want you to know that this morning, he stopped, started again. What happened this morning was based on information I had at the time. Emily typed something into the chart. All right. I wasn't aware of your background. That's true. He waited for something more. She didn't give it. I'm saying the situation may have been handled differently with more information. She looked up from the screen. Captain Rourke, I have 17 patients on this floor, a federal investigation ongoing in my building, and a dressing in room 4 that needs to be checked in an hour. She held his gaze. If you'd like to speak to me about this morning, you can go through the hospital administration's process. They'll schedule something appropriate. She went back to the chart. Is there a medical reason you need to be in this unit? A pause. No. Then you'll want to check with the federal investigators before you move around the building. I believe they've restricted non-essential access to several areas. Rourke stood there another moment. The hat turned in his hands. Then he left. Petra, at the station beside Emily, was very carefully looking at her computer screen and not reacting. You can say it, Emily said. I'm not saying anything. You want to? A pause. That was extremely cool, Petra said. I'm not saying that, but it was. Emily entered the last field in the chart. Get me the next patient summary and check on bed 4 in 45 minutes, not an hour. The dressing. On it. Yeah. The thing about hospitals was that they didn't stop for anything. Not for federal investigations, not for military personnel in the corridors, not for the particular controlled chaos that had descended on Pinecrest Regional since the helicopters landed that morning. Somewhere around 3 p.m., a 67-year-old man came in through the emergency bay with a suspected stroke and everything else on the floor reorganized around that. Emily was in the trauma bay within 90 seconds of the alert, working alongside Dr. Okonkwo, and for the next 55 minutes she existed entirely within the patient in front of her. His pressure, his pupils, his language deficits, the window of time that was closing, and the specific sequence of interventions that might hold it open. His name was Mr. Daley Hurst. He had a Brookhaven general contractor's hat still on his head when they rolled him in. She found out later that his grandson had been the one to call 911. He made it through the first critical window. That wasn't a guarantee of anything, but it was something. Emily was washing her hands at the scrub sink when Hobart found her again. This time he looked worse than before. The particular deterioration of someone for whom the mission focus was being overridden by something that didn't fit the expected shape of the mission. We have a problem, he said. She turned off the water. What kind? The access log from the south entrance. He stopped. He seemed to be choosing the next words carefully. One of the badge entries from the fake inspection, 6 weeks ago. The ID number cross-referenced to a current hospital employee. Not the person the ID belongs to. Same number, different person. Emily stared at him. Someone cloned a badge. Someone cloned a badge, yes. But the person whose badge was cloned, they're still working in this building. They're on shift today. Who? A man named Gareth Sloan. He works in the pharmacy unit. He's been with the hospital for 4 years. Clean record. Nothing flagged on any previous review. Hobart paused. He's not the suspect. His badge was used without his knowledge. But whoever used it knew enough about his access profile to pick him specifically. Someone who had clearance to move between floors and the service corridors without triggering the system. So the suspect knows this building and knows the staff. Well enough to pick the right person's credentials. Emily was already thinking through the pharmacy unit. 3rd floor, east wing. Above and adjacent to the HVAC junction that DeVoe had shown her in the basement. A pharmacy employee would have access to. She was running the list in her head before Hobart finished his next sentence. The other thing, he said, and his voice dropped even lower. Agent Solis ran the morning's medication dispensation records against the IV complication. She found a flag, a compound that shouldn't have been in the system logged out yesterday evening under a routine order. The order was real, the attached note authorizing an additional compound that was added manually after the fact. From which terminal? Pharmacy, 3rd floor. The log shows the user ID of a part-time tech who was off yesterday. Their password was used remotely. Emily dried her hands. Her mind was running clean and cold, the way it did when a situation sharpened enough that emotion stopped being relevant. She'd been in that mode before. She recognized the particular absence of feeling that accompanied it. Not numbness, more like the volume being turned down on everything except what was directly in front of her. Someone with access to pharmacy credentials and knowledge of the building's service layout inserted themselves into the system before the patient arrived. They prepared the compound, logged it against a ghost order, introduced it into the IV line via the ventilation duct access, and then remained in the building. She looked at Hobart. They're still here. That's what Agent Solis believes. And DeVoe? He's briefing the federal team now. They're preparing to... The intercom system crackled. Overhead, through the entire floor, the bland, automated voice of the hospital paging system came on. Code Gray, East Stairwell, Level 3. Code Gray, East Stairwell, Level 3. Security to East Stairwell. Code Gray, combative or unauthorized individual. Emily was already moving. The East Stairwell on Level 3 was not a busy space. It connected the older wing of the building to the main structure, and was mostly used by staff who preferred stairs to the elevator when moving between floors with their hands full. At 4:18 in the afternoon, most of the people who might normally be in that area were at shift change prep or in patient rooms. The security guard who had triggered the code Gray, a man named Tervis who worked building security and not police, who had a radio and a can of pepper spray and no firearms, was standing at the bottom of the stairwell when Emily arrived, and he looked the way people look when they've done the right thing and are now very relieved that other people have arrived to handle what comes next. He's up there, Tervis said. Level 3 landing. He had a bag. I asked for his ID, he gave me a name that didn't match his badge, and when I said I needed to verify, he went up. Did you get a look at the bag? Carry-on size, hard case. I couldn't see what was in it. Emily looked up the stairwell. She could hear movement on the landing above. Not running, not frantic, but purposeful. Someone who was trying to find an exit and thinking through options. She took the stairs. She was aware this was not her role. She was a nurse. There were federal agents in this building and military personnel on the roof and a security system that had just been activated. The rational response was to wait for people with actual authority to handle this. She also knew that the east stairwell connected to a service exit on the level 2 landing that opened onto the hospital's side lot, a door that used a mechanical override rather than a key card, which meant it was a gap in the electronic monitoring system. She'd identified it during one of her walks. She'd flagged it mentally as a vulnerability and then never mentioned it to anyone because there had been nothing specific enough to flag it to. She took the stairs at a controlled pace. Not running. Running changed the sound profile, announced approach, potentially accelerated a reaction she wasn't ready for. She moved the way she'd been trained, weight forward, footfalls quiet, body close to the wall. The level 3 landing came into view. The man was standing at the door to the main corridor, and he was listening. He had a bag on his shoulder, the hard-sided carry-on Tervis had described, and he was wearing a maintenance uniform that fit him slightly wrong, the shirt too large at the shoulders in a way that suggested it wasn't his. He was in his late 30s, maybe 40, with the build of someone who was fit but not trained, the fitness of a person who took care of themselves, not of someone who had been made to take care of themselves for a purpose. He heard her. Of course he did. The stairwell was concrete, and her shoes made a sound no matter how careful she was. He turned. For a fraction of a second, they looked at each other. Emily Carter, in her nursing scrubs, standing on the stairs below him. And then he moved, not toward the corridor door, which she'd half expected, but toward the level 2 door, the one she'd been thinking about, the service exit. He'd done the same calculation she had. He knew where the gap was. She moved faster. She didn't catch him at the door. She got her hand on the bag strap as he was pulling the door open, and the strap held for 2 seconds, long enough to cost him his momentum, long enough for the door's mechanical resistance to slow the whole sequence. And then the strap broke and he was through the door, and she was on the landing with a broken strap in her hand and the sound of his footsteps on the exterior stairs beyond. She had his bag. She stood there for a moment, breathing. Her pulse was up. Her hands were steady. She looked at the bag. It was locked. A 3-digit combination on a compact roller latch, the kind you could open in under a minute if you knew what you were doing, faster if you didn't care about the hardware. She keyed her radio. "This is Carter, on the east stairwell, level 2. Suspect just exited through the service door, heading east on foot. He's on foot, south side lot." Hobart's voice came back immediately. "We have him on exterior camera. Team is moving." "I have his bag." A pause. "Don't open it." "I'm not opening it." She looked at the strap in her other hand. "He broke his own bag getting away from me. That's going to matter later." She sat down on the landing. Her heart was doing something loud, and it took her a moment to realize it wasn't from the physical exertion. It was from the particular aftermath of the adrenaline residue of something that could have been significantly worse and wasn't, and the knowledge that the gap between those two things had been very small and hadn't entirely been in her control. She was a nurse. She worked a trauma floor. She was not supposed to be in a stairwell holding a broken bag strap. She sat with that for exactly 30 seconds. Then she stood up, radioed her position again, and waited for DeVoe's team to come to her. They took the bag. They took her statement, right there on the landing, Solis with a recorder and a legal pad, going through every second of the sequence, with the methodical patience of someone who was going to do this correctly the first time, because there might not be a second time. Emily answered every question the same way she'd answered questions in military debriefs. Exactly what she observed, in sequence, with no interpretation attached unless she labeled it as interpretation. "You initiated physical contact with the suspect," Solis said, not accusatory, just verifying. "I put my hand on his bag. I was attempting to delay his exit long enough for backup to arrive." "You were aware that he was potentially an assassin who had just attempted to kill a federal officer?" "Yes." A pause. "And you still went up the stairs?" Emily looked at her. "He was headed for a gap in your perimeter. If he got through that service exit, he was going to be outside the camera line and into the lot before anyone was positioned to intercept. Someone needed to slow him down. You were the only person available. I was the person who knew about the door." Solis made a note. "You knew about that service exit gap. I flagged it in my head during a walk about 3 months ago. I should have formally reported it." She said it plainly, because it was true. "That's on me." Solis looked at her for a moment. The bag contained 2 items, a burner phone and a vial of an anticoagulant compound, concentrated enough that, introduced into a second IV line, it would have produced symptoms consistent with internal hemorrhage. The original cardiotoxin was apparently intended as the primary mechanism. This appears to have been a backup. The word backup landed heavily. It meant the patient had been meant to die twice. It meant whoever had planned this had anticipated the possibility of the first attempt failing and had built redundancy into the plan. "A backup that he was planning to deploy today," Emily said. "We believe so. The timeline suggests he was going to access the patient during the afternoon shift window, between the federal team's initial sweep and the patient's transfer, when the room would have been accessible." Solis closed her notepad. "You disconnected the IV before the primary mechanism could reach full effect, and your building walk knowledge gave us enough information to identify the pharmacy entry point before he could implement the backup." Emily said nothing. "Lieutenant Carter." Solis said it without any setup, without any particular inflection. "There are 2 outcomes in this situation today. In the first one, a federal intelligence officer is dead, the suspect is gone, and we have a crime scene with no leads and no surviving witness to the medical intervention. In the second one, we have a suspect in custody, a surviving patient, and a chain of evidence." She paused. "You created the second outcome." Emily looked down at the scrub pocket where she'd put the broken bag strap. She didn't know why she'd kept it. Old habit of collecting things that might matter later. "Is the patient going to be okay?" she asked. "He's en route to Harwick. His prognosis is..." cautiously positive given early intervention. Then that's what matters. She meant it. She also knew, sitting on a concrete stairwell landing in a hospital she'd worked at for 7 months, with military personnel in the building and a federal investigation growing around her, that the next few hours were going to require a different kind of steadiness than the kind she'd been using all day. Because upstairs, somewhere in the administrative wing, Captain Rourke was making phone calls to people Emily didn't know yet. And the story he was constructing, about what he'd done this morning, about why, about who Emily Carter was before she walked through the doors of Pinecrest Regional, was going to matter. She could feel the shape of it, the way you can feel weather before it arrives. She stood up, handed Solis the bag strap, and took the stairs back to her floor. Bed 4 still needed a dressing check. Mrs. Featherly's afternoon attending would be there in 20 minutes. Mr. Hurst was in the step-down unit, stable, with his grandson in the chair beside him. And somewhere in a room she hadn't been told the location of, a man named Gareth Sloan, a hospital pharmacist with a cloned badge and no idea that his credentials had been used to try to kill someone, was sitting across from a federal agent and learning that his ordinary Thursday had just become something else entirely. The building was locked down. The suspect was in custody or close to it. The patient was alive. Emily put her badge back on the lanyard around her neck, smoothed her scrubs, and walked through the door to the trauma floor. The charge nurse looked up. "Everything okay?" "Checking on bed 4, Emily said. "Is Petra still on?" "She's at the station." "Good. Tell her I need the afternoon chart updates before 5. She walked to bed 4. She knocked on the door frame. She went in. The patient in bed 4 was a 43-year-old man named Willis Drummond, who had come in 2 days ago with a compound fracture from a construction site accident and had since developed the particular emotional flatness of someone who had been lying in a hospital bed long enough to stop expecting anything interesting to happen. He watched Emily change his dressing with the vague attention of a person watching weather through a window. "You were gone a while," he said. "Building had some activity. I heard helicopters this morning." "You did?" He waited to see if she'd elaborate. She didn't. She finished the dressing, checked the wound margins, clean, no new signs of infection, the swelling was down from yesterday, and made her notes in the chart. "My wife called," Drummond said. "She wants to know if I can be home by the weekend. Talk to Dr. Quinto tomorrow morning. If the margins look like this, it's possible." She capped her pen. "Don't promise her anything tonight." He almost smiled. "You sound like you've met her." Emily hung the chart. "Get some rest." She was back at the nurse's station by 4:55, pulling up the afternoon updates Petra had flagged. The floor had the particular compressed energy of a shift approaching handover, things being wrapped up, things being deferred, the quiet negotiation between what could wait until tomorrow and what couldn't. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a manageable end to a long day. These were not normal circumstances. At 5:03, Hobart appeared at the unit entrance. He wasn't running, but he was moving with the compressed urgency of someone who had been told not to run and was complying technically. "They lost him," he said when he reached Emily. She put down the chart. "What?" "The suspect. He made it to the south lot before the exterior team could close the perimeter. There was a vehicle. It was parked in the contractor space, registered to a cleaning company that doesn't exist. He's gone." The words sat there between them. "The bag," Emily said. "You have the bag." "We have the bag. The phone is a burner, wiped. The compound is being analyzed, but the man himself—" Hobart stopped. He had the look of someone delivering a failure report and not being sure of the protocol for it. "He's not in the building." Emily looked at the board behind the nurse's station. 31 patients. She thought about what Solis had told her on the stairwell landing, the backup, the second compound, the redundancy built into the plan. "If the primary mechanism failed and the backup is compromised," she said slowly, "does he try again, or does he disappear?" Hobart shook his head. "That's what the team is trying to determine. The patient is en route to Harwick. He's out of reach. But if there are people above this individual who want confirmation, then they might send someone else. It's a possibility being taken seriously." Emily looked at him. "Then why are you telling me and not DeVoe?" Lieutenant Colonel DeVoe sent me. He wants you in the conference room on level 4. The federal team is doing a full debrief and he wants you in the room. She looked at the nurse's station. Petra was there, capable. The evening shift was 15 minutes out. The floor was as stable as it was going to be. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She went to the locker room, not to change, but because she needed 60 seconds alone in a quiet space where no one needed anything from her. She sat on the bench in front of her locker and looked at her hands. They were steady, the same as they'd been all day. That was muscle memory, not composure. Composure was a different thing. Composure was knowing the difference between what you could control and what you couldn't, and making your peace with the boundary. She'd been working on that for years and hadn't fully solved it yet. She thought about a man in a maintenance uniform going through a door she'd identified as a gap and never reported. She thought about the 2 seconds she'd had his bag strap in her hand. Then she stood up, rolled her sleeves down, and went to level 4. The conference room had been converted into something unrecognizable from its usual function. The whiteboard that normally held department meeting agendas was covered in a network diagram. Locations, timestamps, ID numbers connected by lines that indicated relationship rather than sequence. Agent Solis was at the head of the table. DeVoe was at the window. 3 people Emily didn't recognize sat with laptops open, and a federal communications officer was running a screen at the far end of the room that showed a live satellite map of Brookhaven and the roads leading out of it. Emily took the chair DeVoe indicated without being told which one. She was the only person in the room in scrubs. "Here's where we are," Solis said without preamble. The suspect, who we're now identifying through partial facial recognition as a man with at least 2 known alias identities, has exited the building and the immediate perimeter. The vehicle he used was abandoned 2 blocks east of here approximately 8 minutes ago. We have it on a traffic camera. He transferred to a second vehicle. We're working on plates. She pulled up a still image on the whiteboard screen. The image was grainy, parking lot camera, bad angle, but showed a figure carrying something under his arm as he moved between vehicles. The carry-on bag was gone. He'd left it on the stairwell landing when Emily grabbed the strap. Whatever he'd taken with him was smaller, pocketed. The burner phone in the bag had been wiped, but not perfectly. Our technical team recovered a partial contact list, 3 numbers. 2 are already disconnected. The 3rd is still active. Solis paused. That number pinged a cell tower in Brookhaven 40 minutes ago. It's still local. The room was quiet. "A third party," DeVoe said from the window. "Potentially, or the number belongs to someone who doesn't yet know they're compromised." Solis looked at her laptop. "We're running the number against our existing intelligence on the operation. What we know is that this level of planning, the false inspection order, the badge cloning, the compound preparation, required support. One person doesn't build this alone." Emily had been listening and watching the room. She looked at DeVoe. "You said earlier that the leak was in the planning chain. Someone knew the patient's destination before the patient did." "That's correct." "Who had access to that routing?" A pause. It was a short pause, but it was the kind of pause that carried information. The pause of people in a room deciding how much to say. "A small planning group," DeVoe said. 6 people with visibility to the transfer logistics. "And you've been looking at all 6? "Since this morning." "Have you cleared any of them?" Another pause, shorter this time. 4, he said. Emily looked at the network diagram on the whiteboard. "Then you have 2 people in a planning group with unresolved clearance status, an active phone number still local, and a suspect who's transferred vehicles and may be receiving instruction." She looked at Solis. "Are you treating this building as still active?" "We're treating the possibility seriously." "That's not the same thing." Solis looked at her directly. "No, it's not." Emily thought about the building's layout. The floor she'd just come from, the access points she'd cataloged over 7 months of walks, the rhythms and gaps she knew because paying attention to her environment was something she'd done for so long it had become indistinguishable from breathing. She thought about the 31 patients downstairs, the evening shift that had just started, the building operating on its ordinary schedule around an extraordinary event. "If there's a third party with a local presence," she said, "and the primary attempt failed and the backup was compromised, what's the next logical move?" "Abort the mission and extract," one of the unknown analysts said. The asset has been moved, the operation is burned. Or, Emily said, they shift the target. The room shifted. The patient is gone, she continued, but the person who disrupted the operation is still in the building, and so is the military command structure that responded to it. If the goal is disruption rather than a single assassination, if this is about sending a message rather than eliminating one specific individual, then the building is still a viable site. She didn't say it to alarm anyone. She said it because it was a logical sequence that needed to be in the room if it wasn't already. DeVoe turned from the window. You think they'd attempt something in the hospital itself, not the patient. I think it's worth considering. She paused. I also think I'm not the right person to assess it. You have an intelligence picture I don't have. But from a purely physical standpoint, the building has 47 minutes before evening visiting hours end, which is the highest foot traffic window of the day. Anyone trying to move inside this building in the next 40 minutes has maximum cover. Solis was already on her radio. The next 20 minutes moved in the way that high-stakes situations moved when the people managing them were competent, quickly, without visible panic, with the kind of organized urgency that looked calm from the outside and was anything but. DeVoe's team moved to close the internal perimeter. Solis coordinated with the federal unit to push the facial recognition results to the 2 hospital entrances that were still admitting visitors. Emily went back to her floor, not because anyone asked her to, but because her floor was her responsibility and she was not going to be somewhere else while it was potentially at risk. Petra met her at the unit entrance. Everything's been quiet. Evening admissions are down. Only one new intake in the last hour, a respiratory case from a nursing home. Who cleared the intake? Dr. Okonkwo. Okay. Emily looked at the board, then at Petra. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking why right now. Petra straightened slightly. All right. Go through the visitors currently on this floor and verify their sign-ins against the physical log, not the electronic system, the paper log at the main nurses' station. Anyone who signed in after 4 p.m., check their ID against what they wrote down. If anything doesn't match, come to me before you say anything to anyone. Petra looked at her for a half second. You think someone's in the building? I think we're being careful. Go. Petra went. Emily walked the floor, not visibly fast, the measured pace of a nurse doing rounds, which was what she was doing and also more than that. She checked in on Drummond in bed 4. She looked at the doorways, the corners, the faces of visitors sitting in chairs beside patients. She was reading the room the way she'd been taught to read environments where something could go wrong. Not with paranoia, just with attention, the quiet scan of a person whose training had made certain kinds of awareness automatic. At 5:44, her radio crackled. Carter, it was Hobart's voice. Level 2, West Corridor. We've got an alert on the visitor camera. Someone signed in 30 minutes ago as a patient's family member. The patient has no family scheduled today. Security is moving, but she was already at the stairwell. Level 2, West Corridor was the hospital's outpatient prep wing. A quieter section of the building, mostly procedure rooms and pre-op prep bays, lower staff density than the trauma floors. It connected to a secondary pharmacy dispensary and through a back corridor to the service elevator bank. Emily came through the stairwell door at a walk, not a run. Running created noise and attention, and she didn't know yet what she was walking into. The West Corridor was fluorescent and empty, the usual low-traffic stillness of a wing winding down for the evening. 3 prep bays on the right side with curtains drawn, a nursing station that was currently unstaffed. The Level 2 prep nurse was on break, Emily knew, because she'd overheard the schedule conversation at handover. The nursing station was not entirely unstaffed. There was someone behind the counter. It was a woman in her late 30s, wearing what appeared at a quick glance to be a standard hospital staff lanyard. She was looking at a computer terminal. She appeared, at a casual observation, to be a staff member at a workstation. What she was not doing was anything Emily recognized from a normal end-of-day workflow. She wasn't charting. She wasn't checking a patient record. She was looking at the pharmacy dispensation system. The same system that the morning's ghost order had been entered through, and her hands were moving with the purpose of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and needed to find it quickly. Emily stopped 10 feet away. The woman heard her. She didn't turn immediately. She finished whatever she was doing first, which in itself communicated something about her training, and then she looked up. For the second time that day, Emily Carter and someone who meant harm to people in this building looked directly at each other. The difference this time was that the woman didn't move toward a door. She looked at Emily, looked at her scrubs, looked at the badge on the lanyard, and said, in a conversational tone that was completely wrong for everything around it, "You're the nurse." Emily said nothing. "The one who pulled the IV this morning." The woman's voice was neutral, almost academic. "That was unexpected." "Step away from the terminal," Emily said. The woman looked at her for a moment. Something in the look suggested she was making a calculation, assessing distance, route, the specific geometry of the corridor. Emily had seen that look before. It wasn't threatening so much as functional, the look of a person deciding which option cost the least. "I'm not going to hurt you," the woman said. "That doesn't change what I said. You're a nurse. This isn't your situation." "You're in my hospital," Emily said. "Step away from the terminal." The woman stepped to the side, not away from the terminal, but lateral to it, which changed the geometry of the space between them. It was a small movement. Emily tracked it. "Whatever you entered in that system," Emily said, "it's already flagged. The federal team has been monitoring dispensation logs since this morning." Something flickered in the woman's expression. The first thing that wasn't calculation. "You're certain of that?" "Yes." A pause. "Then it doesn't matter what I entered." "It matters," Emily said, "because it tells us what the backup plan was." The silence in the corridor lasted about 3 seconds, long enough that Emily could hear the ventilation system running overhead and someone's footsteps 2 floors up, and her own pulse, which was elevated but steady. Then the woman moved. She didn't go for the door behind her. She went for the prep bay to her right, through the curtain, and Emily heard the crash of a tray table going over, and then the particular sound of a window latch. Old West Wing, mechanical windows, the kind that opened outward. And she was through the curtain in 2 seconds, but the window was already open, and the woman was already on the exterior ledge. Level 2, which was 12 feet off the ground, over the hospital's side garden. Emily grabbed the window frame. She looked out. The woman was hanging from the ledge by her hands, already reducing the drop distance. In 4 seconds, she was going to let go, hit the garden mulch below, and run. There was nothing in the immediate exterior space to stop her. The military perimeter had been set on the main lot side of the building, not the garden side, because the garden side had a fence, and the fence had been assessed as a containment element. But Emily had walked the building. She knew the garden fence. She knew there was a maintenance access gate on the north corner that was supposed to be padlocked, and was, as of 6 weeks ago when she'd last walked past it, using a padlock that had been left open because someone had been moving equipment through and hadn't closed it back. She grabbed her radio. "West Side Garden, Level 2 exterior. Suspect dropping from ledge now. North corner gate. It's unsecured. Cover the north corner gate." She heard Hobart's voice start to respond. The woman dropped, hit the mulch, came up running, exactly as Emily had predicted, heading north along the fence line toward the gate. Emily didn't watch. She was already moving back through the prep bay, through the corridor, calculating the fastest internal route to the north end of the building, because the federal team's closest exterior position was on the parking structure side and north corner gate was 30 seconds from the prep bay. If you went through the internal service corridor and exited through the east, she was running now, the specific controlled sprint of someone who knew exactly where they were going, through the corridor, through the service door, down the short passage to the east exit. She hit the east exterior door at the same moment the woman hit the north gate. The gate was padlocked. Someone had locked it. Recently, the padlock was a different color from the old hardware. Someone on the maintenance staff had finally done their job. The woman hit the locked gate and pulled at it once, twice, and in that 2-second gap she heard Emily behind her and turned, and Emily stopped 6 feet away, breathing hard, in a hospital parking lot at dusk with the sounds of the building around them, and the distant movement of people responding to a radio call getting louder by the second. The woman looked at the locked gate. She looked at Emily. She looked at the gate again. "It's locked," Emily said, because sometimes the situation needed a sentence, and that was the only one available. The woman put her hands up. And then Hobart and 2 federal agents came around the corner of the building, and everything that followed happened very fast, and with the professional efficiency of people who had been moving toward this moment for the last several hours. And when it was over, the woman was in restraints, and Emily was standing in the hospital garden with her back against the brick wall, watching the agents work, and trying to remember the last time she'd eaten anything. It had been the half thermos of coffee in the parking lot at 5:52 that morning. She needed to eat something. She also needed to understand what the woman had entered into the pharmacy system before Emily found her at that terminal, because the federal team was going to want to know what had been logged, and whether anything in that log was already in motion inside the building, and whether the patients on her floor, the 31 people she was responsible for, including Mrs. Featherly and Mr. Drummond and the respiratory case Okonkwo had just admitted, were safe. She pushed off the wall. She went back inside. She found the nearest phone and called the pharmacy unit directly. "This is Carter from the trauma floor. I need you to lock your dispensation terminal right now and not release any medication orders logged in the last 30 minutes until a federal agent clears them." She waited. "All of them?" "Yes. I'll explain later." She hung up. She looked at the clock on the wall. 6:09 p.m. She had been on shift for 12 hours and 17 minutes. Somewhere in the administrative wing, the pieces of Captain Rourke's carefully constructed morning were sitting in a federal review file that had been growing all day. Emily didn't know exactly what was in it. She didn't know what Rourke had told the people he'd been calling from the administrative wing. She didn't know whether he was still in the building or whether he'd gone home to prepare a different version of the day's events. What she knew was that Solis had a recorder, and DeVoe had been in that corridor when Rourke had told his officers to put her in cuffs, and 17 people had seen it. The evening shift-charged nurse appeared at the end of the corridor. "Carter, we've got an alert from the pharmacy. They're saying they can't release any orders?" "That's correct. I called it in. Federal hold. Get me Dr. Okonkwo and we'll work through the patient list manually. Anything time-critical, we flag and get verbal authorization from the attending." The charge nurse stared at her for a half-second. "You're not even supposed to be on this floor right now. Your shift ended." "I know." Emily was already walking. "Tell me which patients have pending orders, and let's start there." Behind her through the exterior wall, she could hear the federal vehicles pulling around to the garden side of the building. She could hear faintly the radio traffic that preceded the organized language of an arrest being processed. One thing at a time. The pharmacy terminal log was going to tell them what the woman had entered, and what she'd entered was going to tell them whether this was truly over. Emily was not yet certain that it was. The pharmacy terminal log contained 11 entries made in a 4-minute window between 5:31 and 5:35 p.m. Solis read them aloud in the conference room at 6:47 p.m., while Emily stood at the whiteboard with a cup of cold coffee someone had handed her and forgotten about. Most of the entries were reconnaissance. The woman had been pulling patient records, cross-referencing admission dates with medication schedules, looking for something specific in the system. 3 of the entries were read-only queries, but the last 2 were not. She modified 2 existing orders, Solis said, both for patients currently admitted. One is a potassium chloride drip rate adjustment. Looks legitimate on the surface, flagged as a physician authorization, but the physician ID attached to it belongs to a Dr. Quinto, who clocked out at 4:30 and wasn't in the system after that. Emily set down the coffee. "Which patient?" Solis looked at the sheet. "A man named Drummond. Bed 4, trauma floor." The name landed like something physical. Emily was already moving before Solis finished the sentence. She didn't run. Running in hospital corridors caused the wrong kind of attention and slowed response times when staff stopped to look. But she moved at the fastest pace that read as purposeful rather than panicked, through the conference room door, down the level 4 corridor, into the stairwell. Her mind was running the calculation as she descended. The order had been entered at 5:34. It was now 6:47, over an hour. If the modified drip rate had been implemented at medication change, the evening med round started at 6, which was standard. Then Drummond had been receiving an elevated potassium chloride rate for approximately 45 minutes. The cardiac effects of sustained elevated potassium would begin presenting within 30 to 60 minutes. Arrhythmia first, then progression. She hit the trauma floor at a near run. Petra was at the nurse's station. She looked up, clocked Emily's face, and stood before Emily said anything. "Bed 4, Emily said. "When did his evening drip get checked?" Petra's expression shifted. 6:15. The evening nurse ran the round. "Get me a crash cart to bed 4 right now and pull Dr. Okonkwo. Do not page overhead. Just reach him directly. Go." She was through the door of bed 4 before Petra had finished turning. Willis Drummond was awake. That was the first thing she registered. He was awake and talking, or had been talking, to someone on his phone, which he lowered when she came in. His color was off in a way that was subtle enough that a less experienced eye might have missed it in the room's light. The slight grayness around his mouth, the way he was holding himself in the bed, shoulders slightly forward. "Your chest feel tight?" she said, already at the IV pole. "A little. Thought it was... How'd you know?" She checked the drip rate. The number on the pump confirmed it. The rate had been modified. Not catastrophically, not the kind of number that would trigger an automatic pump alarm, but enough. Consistent with what someone would enter if they wanted the effects to look natural and present slowly. She stopped the infusion. Full stop, not a reduction. She would deal with the consequences of that on his other medications in a moment. First, she needed the potassium chloride out of the active line. "I need you to stay still and stay calm," she said. "You're not in immediate danger, but your medication rate was adjusted without proper authorization, and I'm correcting it." Drummond put his phone down. "What does that mean?" "It means someone made a change to your IV that shouldn't have been made. I'm fixing it." "Someone..." He stopped. "Like on purpose?" "I don't know yet." She did know. She just wasn't going to say it to a patient alone in a room while she was still managing the physical situation. "I need you to tell me if you feel anything change, chest pressure, arm tingling, lightheadedness, anything." "My chest was tight for maybe 20 minutes. I thought it was from lying on my side." "Okay, that was real. Tell me if it gets worse." Okonkwo arrived 2 minutes later, read the room immediately, checked Drummond's rhythm on the portable monitor Petra had wheeled in, and started working without any unnecessary conversation. Emily stayed at the bedside. Together they ran through the intervention sequence with the efficiency of two people who had worked alongside each other long enough to anticipate the next step. Drummond's rhythm was irregular but not yet critical. They had caught it at the threshold, not past it. At 7:09 p.m., Drummond's monitor showed a stabilizing pattern. Not normalized yet, but moving in the right direction. Emily leaned against the wall outside his room. Her legs were doing something she didn't like, a faint tremor in the quads from hours of sustained physical and neurological load. She pressed the wall with her back and breathed deliberately for 15 seconds. Okonkwo came out. He looked at her for a moment. "You okay? What's the second patient?" Solis called down. The other modified order was flagged before it reached the floor. It was in the queue but hadn't been dispensed. They pulled it in time. Emily closed her eyes briefly. "And Drummond?" "He's going to be okay. The rhythm is responding. We'll monitor overnight, but the intervention was early enough." He paused. "Early because you move fast." "I should have locked the pharmacy system 2 hours earlier." "You were managing 7 other things." "That's not..." She stopped. It wasn't worth finishing. The gap existed whether it was understandable or not. Drummond had been in that bed for 45 minutes with a modified drip because Emily hadn't moved fast enough on the pharmacy call. He was going to be okay, but the margin was smaller than it should have been, and she knew it, and that knowledge was going to sit in her somewhere for a while. That was the job too. Not just the saves, also the margins. "Go home," Okonkwo said. "I need to give a statement to Solis about the terminal." "Then do that and go home." She pushed off the wall. "Tell Drummond I'll check on him in the morning." "I'll tell him." The debrief with Solis lasted 90 minutes. It took place in the conference room on level 4, which by this point felt like a location Emily had known for years rather than hours. The Federal Communications Officer was still there. The satellite map was still on the screen, though the active tracking overlays had been replaced by static location markers. The positions where events had occurred, the routes the suspects had taken, the physical geometry of a day that had tried to kill one person and almost killed a second one as a contingency. The woman from the garden, whose name the federal team had confirmed as Vera Malton, a name attached to a contractor identity that had been in active use for approximately 3 years, was in federal custody. The primary suspect from the stairwell had been picked up by state police 40 miles outside Brookhaven at 7:52 p.m. in a vehicle that had been flagged through the plate transfer Solis's team had been tracking since the parking lot camera caught his vehicle swap. He had said nothing yet. Malton had said slightly more, which in federal terms meant she'd acknowledged her name and stopped there. The intelligence picture was still incomplete. The 2 uncleared members of the planning group, the people who had visibility to the patient's transfer logistics, were in separate federal interviews. DeVoe didn't appear in the debrief room until the last 20 minutes, and when he did, he had the look of a man who had been receiving information in another room that had revised his understanding of several things. He sat down across from Emily. Solis kept writing. The communications officer didn't look up. "One of the 2, DeVoe said. He didn't need to complete the sentence. "Which one?" Emily said. "A logistics coordinator named Parrish. He's been with the planning office for 6 years. Clean record, good reviews." He put his hands flat on the table. "He had a financial situation that we weren't aware of. It looks like the approach was made 8 months ago. He was used as a source for the patient's routing and for hospital access protocols." "He's cooperating?" "When presented with the phone number we recovered from the burner and the cell tower data showing it active in Brookhaven today, yes, he's cooperating." DeVoe's voice was level and careful, the way it was when he was managing his own reaction to something. "He didn't know people were going to die. That's what he's saying." Emily looked at the table. "People didn't die." "No. But Parrish didn't know that when he made his decision." A pause. "No, he didn't." The room was quiet for a moment. Emily thought about a man making a financial calculation 8 months ago, weighing something against something else, deciding the balance worked out. She didn't feel much about it that she could articulate cleanly. It was too layered, too specific, the kind of thing that required more information than she had, and more distance than the current hour allowed. "Is that everything?" she said. "There's one more thing." DeVoe looked at Solis. Solis set down her pen. "The federal review of this morning's incident, specifically the conduct of Captain Rourke and his officers, is complete for initial assessment. What we have on record, between witness statements, Emily's own incident report, and the security footage from the trauma corridor, is sufficient to refer the matter for formal investigation." Emily waited. "What the footage shows," Solis said, "is a law enforcement officer ordering medical personnel to stand down during an active cardiac emergency, on the basis of no medical training or legitimate authority to make that call. It shows physical intimidation in a hospital corridor. And it shows an officer ordering the restraint of a nurse who had just performed a life-saving intervention on a federal officer." She paused. "That's before we get to the question of what Rourke told his supervisors about the morning's events." "What did he tell them?" Solis looked at her flatly. "He filed an internal report at 2 p.m. stating that he had been informed of a civilian interference situation and had responded appropriately, and that the subsequent military presence had been a pre-planned operational response that he had been coordinating with." She let that sit. "He did not mention his orders to have you removed. He did not mention the physical proximity incident in the corridor. He did not mention that his officers were in the room when you disconnected the IV." Emily absorbed that. He tried to write himself into the response instead of out of it. He tried to write a version of the day in which his conduct was standard and his authority was never disrupted. And the footage? The footage says otherwise, as do 11 staff members who were in or adjacent to that corridor this morning. Solis picked up her pen again. "His supervising deputy chief has been notified. As of 40 minutes ago, Rourke is on administrative leave pending formal review. His badge and service weapon were collected at the department." Emily sat with that. She'd been in the building for 14 hours. She'd disconnected one IV line, intervened in 2 separate suspect encounters, flagged a pharmacy breach, and stabilized a patient in the margin between a modified drip and a cardiac event. She was tired in a way that went past the physical into something more structural. She thought about Rourke in that corridor this morning, his voice loud enough to make sure everyone heard, his hand 6 inches from her face. The specific performance of it, the public diminishment, the machinery of a person who used institutional authority like a tool to reduce other people to a manageable size. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something flatter and more complicated than that. Relief wasn't quite right either. It was more like the particular quiet that followed a long period of noise. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Solis nodded once. "The formal review will likely take several weeks. You may be asked to provide additional statements. Everything you've already documented is thorough and will hold up." "Okay." DeVoe walked her to the elevator. They stood in the hallway outside the conference room, and he looked at her the way he sometimes did, like he was trying to read something she hadn't shown him. "You could have identified yourself this morning," he said. "We had this conversation." "I know, I'm still thinking about your answer." And I think you were right that it wouldn't have helped the patient. I also think—" He stopped. "I think you've been doing this for a long time, choosing the useful action over the recognized one." Emily looked at the elevator. "It's a habit." "It's more than a habit." She looked at him. "Are we done for tonight?" He almost smiled. It was the same compressed, reluctant expression he'd had for 20 years whenever she deflected. "Yes, we're done for tonight." He reached into his jacket and handed her a card. "The formal commendation process starts next week. It's mandatory, so the federal involvement means the documentation is going to be thorough. You'll need to be available for it." She took the card. "I'll be here. I work Tuesday through Saturday." "Emily," he said it quietly, "what happened here today? You know what this looks like on paper." "I know what it looks like." "Then you know that people are going to want to talk about it." "People can want a lot of things." She pressed the elevator button. "Good night, sir." She ate in the hospital cafeteria because it was 9:15 and the cafeteria was still open, and the alternative was driving home on a $12 coffee budget and an empty stomach. She got soup and a piece of bread that had been sitting under a heat lamp too long and sat at a table in the far corner with her phone face down and ate slowly. 3 nurses from the evening shift came in about 10 minutes after her. They saw her, and one of them, a woman named Gail, who had been at Pinecrest for 12 years and generally operated with the unsentimental efficiency of someone who had seen everything twice, stopped at her table. "You doing okay?" "Eating," Emily said. "The whole building's talking," Gail said, "about what happened today. What you did. I disconnected an IV line and got in the way of someone trying to leave." Gail looked at her for a moment. "Right. She didn't push it. She went to get her food. But when she passed the table again on her way out, she put her hand briefly on Emily's shoulder, 1 second, nothing dramatic, and kept walking." Emily finished the soup. It was too salty. She finished it anyway. She was in the parking lot, keys in hand, at 9:47 when her phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. "Is this Emily Carter?" Not a question exactly. The voice was male, older, with the careful diction of someone who had practiced what they were going to say. "Who's calling?" "My name is Deputy Chief Warren Salk. I'm Captain Rourke's supervising officer." A pause. "I understand you were involved in the events at Pinecrest Regional today." "I was." "I want you to know that what happened this morning, the conduct you were subjected to, that is not representative of how this department operates. I intend to make that clear through the formal process." Emily stood in the parking lot. The night air was warm and smelled like asphalt and someone's car exhaust 2 spaces over. She looked at the hospital building, the lit windows on the upper floors, the emergency bay still bright on the east side, the ordinary continuation of a building that never fully stopped. "I appreciate that," she said. "Captain Rourke has been a member of this department for 19 years. This situation it's difficult." He paused, and in the pause she could hear him choosing between what he wanted to say and what he'd decided to say. "But difficult doesn't mean avoidable. The review will be thorough. I wanted you to hear that from me directly." "All right. Is there anything you need from this department right now?" Emily thought about the question, about what she needed and whether this was the person to provide it, and whether need was even the right frame for what had happened today. "I need to know," she said, "whether the officers who were in the room this morning, the two who were instructed to remove me from the patient's bedside, whether they're going to be asked to account for what they did." A pause. Longer this time. "They're included in the review." "That's not an answer." Another pause. "They'll be asked to provide full statements, and those statements will be evaluated against the footage and witness accounts. If their conduct warrants action, action will follow." He said it with the weight of a man who was not used to being pushed and was deciding in real time not to push back. "That's the process. I can't get ahead of it." "I understand," Emily said. "Thank you for calling." She hung up. She stood there another moment in the parking lot, with the hospital behind her and the empty road ahead. She drove home. The apartment was the same as she'd left it at 5:45 that morning, which was both obvious and, at this hour, faintly surreal. The breakfast dish she hadn't had time to wash, the jacket over the chair, the particular stillness of a space that hadn't participated in anything the day had contained. She showered. She changed. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for about 4 minutes and didn't think about anything specific, which was not emptiness so much as the decompression that her nervous system demanded after certain kinds of days. Then she checked her messages. Okonkwo had texted, "Drummond stable, rhythm normalized," asking about his dressing again. "He'll be fine." Petra had sent a longer message that was mostly update information with one line at the end that read, "I'm really glad you were here today." She didn't reply to either of them. She would in the morning. There was a third message. She didn't recognize the number, but the area code was different. Not local, not Brookhaven. She opened it. "Lieutenant Carter. This is Colonel Ansel Brigg, Office of the Inspector General, Joint Federal Task Force. I've been reviewing the Pinecrest incident report. I need to speak with you tomorrow regarding Captain Rourke's prior conduct record. There are aspects of this investigation that have expanded beyond today's events. Call this number at your earliest availability." Emily read it twice, then a third time. Prior conduct record, expanded beyond today's events. She put the phone down on the nightstand. She looked at the ceiling. Something that had been sitting at the edge of her awareness for most of the evening, something she hadn't been ready to name, started to take a more definite shape. Rourke had known who the patient in bed 12 was. He had specifically told Emily not to enter that room, not to discuss that patient, not to ask questions. He had been at Pinecrest since 5 a.m., before the patient's acute crisis, before any of the morning's events. And the specific language he had used, not just authority language, but knowledge language, the language of someone who had been briefed on who was in that bed and why it mattered, had been sitting in the back of Emily's mind without a frame. She thought about the planning group, about Parrish, the logistics coordinator who'd been approached 8 months ago, about the information that had needed to leak for the operation to be built, not just the patient's destination, but the protocols, the floor access, the specific windows in the monitoring schedule. Parrish had provided the routing and the hospital access protocols, but someone had to tell the people running this operation which specific hospital staff would be manageable, who on that floor could be moved aside quickly, who had jurisdiction over the room, who, if instructed to stand down, would stand down. She sat up. Someone had told them about the police presence at Pinecrest, about Rourke's regular coordination with the hospital on security matters, about his schedule, his access, his authority over the trauma floor. She picked up her phone. She looked at Colonel Brigg's message again. Prior conduct record, aspects that have expanded beyond today's events. Rourke had arrived at Pinecrest at 5 a.m., 2 hours before his usual coordination window. He had specifically secured the room in a way that reduced civilian medical access. He had immediately moved to remove Emily from the floor when she intervened. He had filed an internal report that erased his own conduct from the record. And somewhere in the federal investigation, a phone number recovered from a burner had connected to a cell tower in Brookhaven. 3 numbers, 2 already disconnected. 1 still active at 40 minutes past the alert. Solis had said the 3rd number belonged to someone who might not know they were compromised. But what if they did know? Emily sat on the edge of her bed at 11:23 p.m. and looked at the message on her phone and felt the specific cold clarity of a conclusion that she had been moving toward all day without being able to see the final shape of it until this exact moment. She called the number. It rang 4 times. Then a recorded message. You've reached the desk of Captain Daniel Rourke, Brookhaven PD. Please leave a message or call the department's main line. She hung up. She sat there for a long time. Then she called Colonel Briggs' number and left a message saying she was available first thing in the morning, whatever time he needed, wherever he needed her to be. Colonel Briggs called back at 6:17 a.m. Emily was already up. She'd slept 4 hours in the middle, the hard practical sleep of a body that had run out of options, and woken at 5 with the particular alertness of someone whose mind had kept working without her. She was at the kitchen table with coffee when the phone rang, and she answered it on the first ring. Lieutenant Carter. His voice was direct, no warm-up. I've reviewed everything Solis's team filed overnight. I want to meet in person. There are things I need to walk you through that aren't appropriate for a phone conversation. Where? Pinecrest Regional, Conference Room 4, 8 a.m. A pause. I'm also going to ask you to bring anything you personally observed about Captain Rourke's conduct across your 7 months at that hospital, not just yesterday. Everything. She hadn't told anyone about the voicemail. She hadn't told anyone about the phone number or the conclusion she'd arrived at sitting on the edge of her bed at 11:30 the previous night. She'd left a message saying she was available, and then she'd lain down and closed her eyes and let her brain work through it without her interference. I'll be there, she said. She hung up and looked at her coffee. It had gone cold while she was sleeping. She made a new cup and sat back down and thought about 7 months. The specific texture of 7 months in a place. The things you notice not because you're looking for them, but because attention is a habit, and habits don't stop running. Rourke at Pinecrest, on average, twice a week. The coordination meetings in the administrative conference room, which was standard protocol for a hospital with a Level 2 trauma designation. The way he moved through the building, not like a visitor, not like someone managing a professional relationship, but like someone who had decided the building was an extension of his jurisdiction. The way certain administrators deferred to him in conversations Emily had been adjacent to without being included in. The particular ease of a man who had been told, repeatedly, by the institutional environment around him, that his presence was welcome and his authority was real. She'd logged it the way she logged everything, not in writing, not formally, just in the cataloging part of her that never fully turned off. She'd categorized it under the kind of thing that wasn't her problem yet. Yesterday, it had become her problem. The conference room on level 4 looked different at 8 in the morning than it had the previous evening. The satellite map was gone. The network diagram on the whiteboard had been replaced by a clean surface. 3 people sat at the table. Solis, who looked like she'd slept approximately as much as Emily had, DeVoe, and a man in his 50s, Emily hadn't met before, who had the specific bearing of someone who spent most of his professional life in rooms where consequential things were decided. Colonel Briggs stood when she came in. He was taller than she'd expected from a voice on a phone, 6'2", with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of handshake that communicated both respect and expectation. Lieutenant Carter, thank you for coming. I work here, she said, which got a small, genuine reaction from Solis. Not quite a smile, but close. Briggs sat. Emily sat. DeVoe poured her coffee from the carafe on the table without asking, which she noted. I'm going to be direct with you because the situation warrants it, Briggs said. The federal investigation into yesterday's events has expanded. What began as an assassination attempt on an intelligence officer has developed evidence of a secondary breach, specifically a breach within Brookhaven PD's liaison structure with this hospital. Emily held her coffee cup. She waited. The 3rd number on the burner phone recovered from the stairwell, Briggs continued. We identified the registered source through a subpoena executed at 4 a.m. The number routes through a secondary prepaid line, but the purchase location and subsequent usage pattern connect it to a specific individual. He paused. That individual is Captain Daniel Rourke. The room was quiet. He's been under financial scrutiny in a separate state investigation for approximately 14 months, Briggs said. That investigation hadn't crossed into federal territory until yesterday. It has now. He set a folder on the table but didn't open it. What we believe happened is this. Rourke was not a principal architect of the assassination plot. He was a facilitator. He provided information about hospital access protocols, security coordination windows, and the specific scheduling of federal patient transfers that came through his official liaison role. He was paid for that access. He did not know, or claims not to have known, the full scope of what the information was being used for. But he knew enough to show up at 5 a.m., Emily said. Yes. And to make sure the room was secured against normal medical access. Yes. And to remove me from the floor when I intervened. Brigg looked at her steadily. Yes. She set down her coffee. Then he knew enough. That's the federal position. He paused. There's one additional element. The internal report Rourke filed at 2 p.m. yesterday, the one that omitted his conduct and reframed his presence as coordinated, that report was filed after he would have been aware that the primary operation had failed. We believe he was attempting to construct cover in advance of the investigation widening. He looked at her. That filing constitutes obstruction. It's the clearest charge in the package, Solis spoke. His phone was seized last night pursuant to the federal warrant. The data recovery is ongoing. What we have already is sufficient. Emily thought about the voicemail. You've reached the desk of Captain Daniel Rourke, the recorded voice of a man who had spent yesterday morning trying to make her small, trying to make her a problem to be managed, operating from the assumption that his authority was a wall she couldn't get around. She thought about what it cost. Not yesterday, but all the days before it. The twice-weekly presence of a man who moved through this building like he owned it, whose deference collecting was so practiced that nobody around him thought to call it what it was. The way institutions protect people like that, not through active conspiracy, but through the accumulating weight of everyone deciding it wasn't their problem yet. What happens now? She said. Not to Brigg specifically, to the room. Brigg answered anyway. Rourke is in federal custody as of 6 a.m. this morning. He was arrested at his residence. The department has been notified, and Deputy Chief Salk is managing the internal communication. He paused. There will be a press statement from the federal task force later today. It will be factual, and it will be public. Emily looked at the table. Public. The word had a specific weight. It meant it was going to be in the news. It meant Brookhaven was going to spend the next several weeks reading about what had happened in this hospital, in the corridors and stairwells and pharmacy terminals of a building that 800 people moved through on an ordinary day. It meant that the story of what Rourke had done, not just to the intelligence officer in bed 12, but in the longer accumulation of a career built on that particular brand of unquestioned authority, was going to become part of the public record. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. It was complicated in the way that justice is usually complicated. It was the right outcome, and it was also a loud and disruptive and imperfect process that was going to land on a lot of people who hadn't asked for it. Lieutenant Carter, Brigg's voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate. I want to make clear on the record that the Federal Task Force's assessment of your conduct yesterday is unambiguous. Every action you took was consistent with your medical duties, your training, and the ethical obligations of your position. The initial accusations made against you this morning, the threat of obstruction charges, the order for removal, have been formally reviewed and found to be entirely without basis. He paused. A formal letter of clearance will be issued today. It will be copied to this hospital's administration, to the state nursing board, and to the personnel file. Emily looked at him. I wasn't worried about my license. I know, but the record should be clean regardless of what you were worried about. All right. DeVoe spoke for the first time since she'd sat down. There's a commendation process that will run through the military side. Given your service record and what you did here yesterday, not just the IV intervention, but the access log identification, the pharmacy flag, the physical intercept in the stairwell, the documentation is going to reflect the full picture. Marcus. She used his first name because they were past the point of pretending otherwise. I didn't do any of that for a commendation. I know that too. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen yesterday, the complicated one, the one that had something older in it than professional regard. You never do anything for the recognition. That doesn't mean the recognition isn't warranted. She didn't answer that. She picked up her coffee and found that it was still warm and drank it. She was on the floor by 8:45. Drummond was awake and already arguing mildly with the morning attending about when he could get up and walk the corridor. His rhythm had fully normalized overnight. His color was back. He had his construction company hat sitting on the bedside table, which made Emily think he was planning to put it back on the moment someone gave him permission. She stood in the doorway of his room. He saw her. "You checked on me," he said. "Not a question." "I said I would." He looked at her for a moment. He was the kind of man who processed things physically. She could see him working through something, his jaw shifting slightly, his hands adjusting on the blanket. "The nurse last night told me someone adjusted my medication wrong, that it could have—" He stopped. "She said you caught it." "The monitor caught it. I responded to the monitor." "That's not what she said." Emily came into the room and checked his chart, making notes in the morning column. "Your rhythm is clean. Dr. Okonkwo is going to want to watch you one more day to be sure, but if the afternoon panel looks like this morning, you'll probably be home tomorrow." "My wife. Don't promise her tonight." She hung the chart. "Promise her tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. It came out slightly rougher than she thought he intended, the voice of a man who didn't say that kind of thing easily and was making himself say it anyway. "Get some rest," she said. She was in the corridor when she heard him say, to no one in particular, "I want to know her name." She didn't slow down, but she registered it, Mrs. Featherly's daughter was back, with Rutherford-related updates and a box of pastries she'd left at the nurses' station for the floor staff, which was kind and was also going to cause a brief territorial situation among the night shift nurses who'd missed it. Emily ate one without guilt while reading the morning handover notes. It was a raspberry Danish that had come from a bakery rather than a grocery store and was better than anything she'd eaten in the past 24 hours. She was halfway through the morning round when Petra appeared at her elbow. "There are people in the administrative wing," Petra said quietly, "like official people, suits, federal investigators, and some of the hospital board, and a woman who said she's from the state nursing board office." She paused. "And a local TV crew in the parking lot." Emily continued walking the corridor. "Let administration handle the media. That's their job. Are you not— Doesn't this bother you? The cameras?" "The cameras are outside. My patients are inside." She stopped at the door of the next room. "Was there a medical question you needed me for?" Petra looked at her for a moment. "You're genuinely the most functional abnormal person I've ever met." "That's a complicated compliment." "It was meant as one." Emily went into the room. But the hospital board called for her at 11 a.m. She went because declining wasn't productive, and because the conversation needed to happen, and because she was better at these rooms when she walked into them on her own terms than when she was summoned into them without agency. The administrative conference room held 7 people: the hospital's CEO, a man named Gerald Forthright, who had the tailored suit and careful neutrality of someone managing a public relations situation in real time; 2 board members whose names Emily didn't know; the chief of nursing, Dr. Amara Yusuf, who had been at Pinecrest for 9 years and who Emily respected without ever having told her so, and 3 other people who were introduced as legal counsel and government liaison. Forthright stood when she entered, which surprised her. "Miss Carter," he extended his hand. "Thank you for making time." She shook it. "I'm on shift." "We won't keep you long." He gestured to a chair. She sat. "I want to begin by saying, on behalf of this hospital's leadership, that what occurred here yesterday, both the criminal activity within this building and the conduct directed at you specifically, falls far short of the standards we hold ourselves to. The board has reviewed the footage and the federal documentation, and we are deeply troubled by what we've seen." Emily waited. There was more coming. She could hear the shape of it. "We're also deeply grateful," Forthright continued, "for what you did. The patient in bed 12, the patient in bed 4, the identification of the security breach. The federal investigators have made clear that the outcomes yesterday were significantly different from what they would have been without your intervention." He paused. "And we want to make sure that the record here reflects that clearly." "The federal record already does," Emily said. "I have a clearance letter coming." "Yes, we've been informed. He looked at Dr. Yusuf, who looked at Emily with an expression that was more direct than the board's careful neutrality. "Emily," Dr. Yusuf said. She used her first name the way DeVoe had, with the weight of someone who'd been waiting for the right moment. "What happened yesterday morning in that corridor? I wasn't there. I should have been more present to the dynamic that allowed something like that to occur in my hospital." She didn't look away. "That's on me." Emily looked at her. The dynamic was produced by someone who was very skilled at operating within institutional structures. It's not an easy thing to see from inside the institution. "No, it isn't." A pause. "But I should have seen it." The room was quiet for a moment. Forthright cleared his throat. "We'd like to offer you a formal position as head of the trauma floor nursing team. The role comes with supervisory authority, a significant salary adjustment, and direct input into the department's medical protocols." He folded his hands. "We think you're the right person for it. We should have recognized that long before yesterday." Emily looked at the table. She looked at Dr. Yusuf. She thought about 7 months of early shifts and flickering fluorescent lights, and the particular invisibility of a person who had chosen it deliberately, and the costs and the returns of that choice. She thought about Mrs. Featherly asking about Rutherford, about Mr. Drummond's hat on the bedside table, about the 61 seconds on the stairwell landing when she'd held a broken bag strap and breathed deliberately and let her pulse come back down. She thought about what she'd come to Brookhaven for 7 months ago. Not to lead a department, not to be recognized, not to find a stage. She'd come because a trauma floor in a mid-sized city was a place where someone with her specific set of skills and knowledge could do a significant amount of good without having to perform it for anyone. The offer was real, and it was warranted, and she was going to take it. But not for the reasons Forthright thought. "I'll take the position," she said, "with one condition." Forthright nodded immediately, which told her he'd been prepared for conditions. "Of course. The security gap I identified in the south access monitoring, the south entrance camera coverage, and the service corridor access logs. Those need to be formally reviewed and updated before the end of the month. Not flagged, not scheduled for review. Done." She looked at him steadily. "And the service exit on the Level 2 West Landing needs a new locking mechanism on the mechanical override. Not a padlock, a keycard reader with logging." Forthright looked at his legal counsel. The counsel made a note. "Done," Forthright said. "Then yes," Emily said. "I'll take the position." The federal press statement went out at 2 p.m. Emily was in the middle of a medication review with Petra when her phone started receiving texts from people she hadn't spoken to in months. Former colleagues, people from her service years, someone from her training cohort who she'd last seen at a debrief in a country she wasn't allowed to name in writing. The texts were mostly brief. "Saw the news. Of course it was you. Of course." She didn't respond to most of them. She would eventually. The statement named Rourke. It named Malton and the primary suspect, both of whom were in federal custody. It referenced the intelligence officer without naming him and confirmed he was receiving treatment and was expected to recover. It used the phrase decisive civilian medical intervention in the context of describing what had prevented the primary attempt from succeeding, which was the kind of language that was technically accurate and also the kind of language that would generate its own momentum in the news cycle. By 3 p.m., there was a second TV crew in the parking lot. DeVoe called at 3:30. She answered between patients. "You've seen the statement," he said. "I've been in the building. Everyone's talking about it. There are going to be interview requests. I assumed you don't have to take them." "I know." A pause. "The patient, the intelligence officer, he's stable. He's been briefed on the full picture. He asked me to convey his personal thanks." Emily was standing in the corridor outside bed 7, where Mrs. Featherly was having a good afternoon, sitting up, eating something her daughter had brought. Through the window, she could see the two of them talking. The specific, comfortable looseness of people who had been scared about each other and were now on the other side of it. "Tell him to focus on recovery," Emily said. DeVoe made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I'll tell him that." "Marcus," she paused. "The commendation. When it gets processed, I want it noted in the documentation that Petra Vasic identified the Bed 4 alert in the handover notes and that Dr. Okonkwo responded without hesitation both times. They were part of what happened here." A pause. I'll make sure it's reflected. Thank you. She hung up and went into Mrs. Featherly's room. The daughter looked up. Mrs. Featherly smiled. You look exhausted, Mrs. Featherly said with the directness of a woman who'd earned the right to say what she saw. Long couple of days. Sit down for a minute. I have 4 more patients. 1 minute won't kill them. She said it in the tone that brooked no argument, and Emily, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, sat in the visitor chair. Mrs. Featherly looked at her. My daughter told me what she saw on the news, that it was here, that you were involved. It was a complicated day. You saved people. People got saved. It's not always the same thing. Mrs. Featherly tilted her head slightly. You know what my husband used to say? He was a carpenter, worked his whole life with his hands. He used to say the hardest thing about doing good work wasn't the skill, it was doing it the same way when nobody was watching as when they were. She paused. That's what it sounded like, from what my daughter said. You did it the same way. Emily looked at the window. Outside, the hospital's garden was in the afternoon light. The same garden where Malton had hit the locked gate the previous evening. The same space that was now just an ordinary patch of green with a locked gate and a maintenance access path and nothing remarkable about it. Get some rest, she said. Your culture numbers look good for tomorrow. She got up. She went to her next patient. Work was arraigned at 4:15 p.m. at the federal courthouse on Millbridge Avenue. Emily wasn't there, she was on the floor. But Gail, who had the particular network of someone who knew what was happening in this city at all times, gave her the summary at handover: 3 federal charges, 2 state charges, bail denied pending assessment of flight risk. The department's internal affairs unit had opened a parallel investigation into his conduct across a 19-year career. 2 former complainants from years prior had already contacted the federal tip line. 19 years, Gail said, with the particular flatness of someone who was angry and keeping it compressed. That's a long time to be in a place and be what he was. Yes, Emily said. Were you scared? Yesterday morning, in the corridor? Emily considered the question. It deserved a real answer. I was calculating, she said. The scared part comes after, when the calculation is done and you have space to notice it. Gail looked at her. And have you noticed it? Working on it, Gail nodded. She handed over the board. Drummond's asking for you, by the way. He wants to know your name. He asked 4 separate people. Emily looked at the board. Tell him, Emily, and tell him to go to sleep. The handover finished. The evening shift settled in. Emily sat at the nurse's station for a few minutes after the outgoing staff had gone. The particular quiet of a floor between movements, when the day has been accounted for and what comes next hasn't started yet. She thought about something she rarely let herself think about directly. The reason she'd left. Not the official reason, not the one on the separation papers. The real one, which was that she'd spent years doing things that were necessary and true and had cost her things she couldn't get back. And at some point the cost and the purpose had gotten out of alignment in a way she couldn't adjust her way out of. She'd needed to come somewhere ordinary and do something ordinary and remember what it felt like to help a single person in a bed in front of her without the weight of something larger hanging over everything. And she'd done that. For 7 months, she'd done exactly that. Yesterday had pulled the larger thing back in. She hadn't asked for it. It had come anyway. She thought about Rourke in the corridor, his hand near her face, the performance of diminishment that he'd been perfecting for 19 years. She thought about the specific cruelty of it, not the physical nearness, but the assumption underneath it, the assumption that she was reducible, that the sum of her could be managed by someone with a badge and a loud voice and an institutional position. She thought about what it meant that he'd been wrong. Not because she'd proven him wrong, not because the helicopters came and the salute happened in public and the room saw it. He'd been wrong before any of that. Wrong at the moment he made the assumption, wrong in the fundamental misreading of what she was. The recognition that followed wasn't what made him wrong. He'd been wrong in the corridor, alone, when the only witness was her. That was what she wanted people to understand, if she could ever find the words for it in a format that fit how people received things. That the diminishment doesn't become true because the person wielding it has authority. That the gap between what someone decides you are and what you actually are doesn't close just because they say it loudly in front of other people. You don't become less because someone insists on seeing less. And the corollary, the harder one, the one she'd been living for years without being fully conscious of it, was that the recognition doesn't make you more either. She wasn't more today than she'd been yesterday morning, walking into the trauma floor with a half-empty thermos of coffee, invisible and unassuming and exactly what she'd chosen to be. She was the same person. The difference was that now the room knew it. She left at 7. The parking lot was clear. The news crews had moved on to the federal courthouse for the arraignment coverage. The evening air was the same warm asphalt smell as the night before, and the hospital behind her was lit the same way, ordinary and continuous, performing its permanent function regardless of what the previous 24 hours had contained. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, different area code than Briggs. She opened it. "This is Wallace Drummond. My dad is in bed 4. He wanted me to send you this." He dictated it word for word. I am not kidding. Below it, a second message. "Emily Carter. I don't usually say this, but someone made sure I was here to say it. Thank you for paying attention when it mattered. From Willis Drummond, bed 4, construction worker, husband, grandfather. P.S. My hat is back on." Emily read it twice. Then she put her phone in the cup holder and sat there for a moment with the particular feeling of something that had no clean name, not happiness, not pride, not relief, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as all of them, something that felt like enough. She started the car. She drove home through the ordinary streets of Brookhaven, a city that wasn't on anyone's top 10 list, that sat in the crease between two interstate systems, that had a hospital with a flickering light in the third panel from the nurse's station that maintenance still hadn't fixed. She was going to fix that light herself tomorrow. She had the maintenance request authority now. It was a small thing. The job was full of small things. That was the whole point. There is a particular kind of person who does the right thing in the exact same way whether the room is watching or not. Not because they're performing integrity, but because they've stopped being able to tell the difference between the private action and the public one. They're the same action. They always were. The world is better when those people are in it. Not because they're extraordinary, though they often are, but because they remind us that the standard exists, that it's possible to be both capable and quiet, both skilled and unannounced, that the person who saves your life in a crisis might be someone you looked past in the hallway an hour before. Pay attention to who's around you. You may not know what they're carrying. You may not know what they've already survived. And you may not know, until the moment that it matters, that the person you dismissed without thinking is the exact person standing between you and the worst possible version of what comes next. Emily Carter drove home. She ate a real meal. She slept 8 hours. In the morning, she went back to work.